And then the YouTube live chat, we can also see.
Mesdames, Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, bonsoir, good evening. On behalf of the Institute's, Graduate Institute's Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy and its co-directors, I would like to welcome you to this event. This event launches our center's program for Democracy Week, an initiative of the Geneva Chancellery of State that gathers 30 partners across the canton of Geneva. We are very honored to have the presence of Chancellor Michel Righetti, who will give an institutional speech of welcome. I would like to thank her for being with us today and for leading this great initiative with her team, in particular Valérie Vuillet-Bourget, Marceau Schroeter, and Céline Bossonnet. We're also very thankful to the US mission for their support to the Democracy Week as one of the thematic weeks in Geneva organized at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Their support has enabled us to invite our keynote speaker, Professor Peggy Cooper-Davis, who especially joined from New York to attend Democracy Week. A big thank you, Professor Cooper-Davis, for accepting our invitation. We are also very honored to have Jamil Shad and Milan Vaishnav, who have joined us today for this panel. Their expertise and insights will be very valuable in exploring the issue of diversity and constitutional rights. My colleague Ravinder Bhavnani, who will moderate the event, will introduce our speakers in a moment. Last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues from the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, and particularly Laura Bellon-Cassis, Michel Holguin, Janina Velp, Maria Maxi, Jérôme Duberry, for all their work on our series of 9 events organized by our center during this week. Many thanks also to the Institute's Directorship of Strategic Partnerships and to Akim Venman and Lega Menge for their support. And I'm also truly grateful to the colleagues from the Institute's Communications and Events departments. I would like to end with a practical note. This event is live streamed on YouTube. You will be able to ask questions both from the room here at Maison de la Paix and from the chat on our YouTube channel. A warm welcome to all the attendees here in Geneva and wherever you are joining us remotely. With no further ado, I would like to give the word to Chancellor Michel Righetti. Madame la Chancelière, la parole est à vous. Merci.
Alors, Madame la directrice exécutive du Centre Albert Hirschman sur la démocratie, Professor Peggy Cooper-Davis, Mr. Jamil Shad, and Mr. Milan Vaishnav, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, I would like to thank you all for your presence. Being with you tonight for the opening of this week of events and celebration dedicated to democracy is both a pleasure and an honor. Of course, I would like to give a particularly warm welcome to all our guests and panelists. You have accepted to come over to Geneva to share your experience and expertise with us. Thank you a lot. Merci sincèrement à vous tous qui êtes là. En 2020, pour la 5e année consécutive, le nombre de pays engagés sur la voie de l'autoritarisme a dépassé celui des pays évoluant vers la démocratie. En outre, ces 10 dernières années, plus de la moitié de toutes les démocraties du monde ont décliné d'une manière ou d'une autre. Ces constats sont partagés par l'Institut international pour la démocratie et l'assistance électorale, qui souligne les reculs préoccupants de certaines des plus grandes démocraties du monde. Les défis posés au système démocratique sont nombreux. Ils ont notamment trait aux défis colossaux et globaux auxquels font face nos sociétés, aux inégalités qui divisent nos populations, à l'engagement citoyen et à l'intérêt pour la res publica, la chose publique, qui ne cesse, semble-t-il, de décliner. Mais prenons du recul et voyons l'histoire. Au siècle dernier déjà, Les totalitarismes ont fait leur lit des inégalités, des crises et de l'apparente incapacité des démocraties à y répondre. Et aujourd'hui encore, les démocraties font face à la pression des autocrates, qui font croire que leur politique serait plus efficace pour relever les défis de notre temps. Cela dit, aujourd'hui, les démocraties ne meurent plus tant entre les mains de généraux, les armes à la main, même si ça arrive encore bien trop souvent. Elles meurent surtout entre les mains de gouvernements démocratiquement élus. Elles meurent également de l'abstentionnisme des électrices et des électeurs. Oui, des gouvernements démocratiquement élus adoptent de plus en plus de stratégies autoritaires, avec le soutien d'une partie de la population ou le silence des autres. Ça peut paraître paradoxal, mais voyez pourtant ces gouvernements démocratiquement élus qui bâillonnent les académiciens, mettent sous pression les journalistes, ciblent la société civile, bref, qui déstabilisent, intimident, polarisent et divisent et qui mettent la démocratie en danger. Il ne s'agit pas d'être naïfs, toutes et tous nous sommes conscients que la démocratie a de multiples défis à relever, en termes d'efficacité, en termes de lutte contre les inégalités, en termes de participation et d'engagement citoyen. Mais malgré ces difficultés, la démocratie doit être cultivée. Cela passe par un traitement respectueux des rivaux, par un respect de la presse libre et de la critique, par la non-remise en question systématique à des fins partisanes ou populistes des processus et résultats électoraux, par la défense des institutions. Mesdames, Messieurs, aucun héritage démocratique ne nous protège de la menace de l'extrémisme. Il faut nous en souvenir. La démocratie n'est pas un acquis. La démocratie a besoin d'être bâtie jour après jour. Je me réjouis de vous entendre à ce sujet et je vous remercie pour votre attention. Thank you all.
Thank you, Madam Chancellor. Good evening to all of you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, as well as our panelists. Peggy Cooper Davis is the John S.R. Shad Professor of Lawyering and Ethics at New York University Law School. She has also served as a judge of the Family Court of the State of New York and engaged extensively in the practice and administration of law. Her scholarly work has been influential in the areas of child welfare, constitutional rights of family liberty, and interdisciplinary analysis of legal pedagogy and process. Her book, Neglected Stories, The Constitution and Family Values, argues for an anti-slavery interpretation of the United States Constitution as amended after the United States Civil War. Our panelist, Milan Vaishav, is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His primary research focus is the political economy of India, and he examines issues such as corruption and governance, state capacity, distributive politics, and electoral behavior. Among others, he is the author of When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, which was awarded the Kalma Devi Chattopadhyay New India Foundation Book Prize for the best non-fiction book on contemporary India, published in 2017. He is an adjunct professor of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and has previously taught at Columbia and George Washington Universities. He also holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Our second panelist is Mr. Jamil Shad, is a journalist who is based in Geneva, Switzerland. In 2011 and 2013, he was elected as the best Brazilian foreign correspondent, a prize given by the media organization Comuniques. In 2015, he was chosen as one of the 40 most influential journalists in Brazil. Since 2000, Mr. Shad has reported from over 60 countries in all continents over the world. Over the last 10 years, he has published 5 books. 2 of them were finalists at the main book prize in Brazil, known as Jabuti. In Switzerland, one of his books won the Nicolas Bouvier Award. Shad was one of the researchers of the National Truth Commission, created by the government of Brazil to investigate crimes and violations of human rights committed during the military regime in the country between 1964 and 1985. He is also part of an international network of specialists dealing with corruption, the Transparency International's anti-corruption solutions and knowledge. We will begin this evening with a keynote by Professor Davis, after which we will move to comments from Dr. Vaishnav and Mr. Shad, followed by a discussion that involves all three panelists. Thank you.
Good evening. Please give me a minute to fix my eyes so that I can see what I'm doing. So, I want to begin, of course, by expressing gratitude for the opportunity to travel from New York to Geneva to see this beautiful country for the very first time and to join with you in a celebration of democracy. I was honored to have had this morning a tour of Geneva's magnificent government buildings and a primer on its magnificently complex and thoughtful system of governance. And for that, I especially thank Deputy Chancellor Villers-Boguet. Surely, this is the perfect country in which to contemplate democracy. Its commitment to proportional representation, its exquisitely thoughtful mix of direct election, referenda, petitions, and initiatives are wonders to behold. I have to add that I am also in awe of Geneva's commitment to multiple languages. 2 days here have deepened my already deep shame that I've always felt as a monolingual American. We who are monolingual suffer in intelligence, empathy, and in the capacity for democratic governance. So I begin with a great deal of humility and deep respect for my hosts. I understand that your theme for this year's Democracy Week celebration is the construction of democracy. So I've chosen to talk about how competing subcultures and competing national stories affect the way the United States has constructed and continues to construct its constitutional system. And I'm eager to discuss with you the cases of India and Brazil, and then to see what we all can learn. More specifically, I'll talk with you today about competing stories of the United States and how those stories affect the country's capacity for democracy. I keep saying stories, and so you will suspect that I am one of those dreaded critical race theory people. I'll use a simple definition of democracy, a system in which citizens have equal opportunity to participate in governance and to share the benefits of collaboration. You see, I'm not a scholar of political systems, just a citizen and a lawyer. I once had the privilege of teaching with a civil rights leader of the 1960s in the United States, who was venerated for his bravery in the pursuit of African American voting rights. He always asks our students this question: What story of the United States do you hold in your head? I'll focus here on how national stories in the heads of students and professors and of citizens, politicians, and judges shape constitutional discourse and meaning in the United States. The national stories that people carry in their heads are illustrated. And as I share with you competing stories, I also want to share with you some of the images that go with those stories. We might start with competing images of place. And we might notice the difference between an indigenous people's vision of home and another people's vision of territory conquered. A decade and a half ago, I participated in a Cape Town conference honoring Loren Ackerman and his service to the South African Constitutional Court. At that time, I learned firsthand about the South African Constitutional Court's commitment to equal respect for the dignity of each human being. I learned that at a gathering reminiscent of this one, a gathering of justices and citizens deeply engaged with scholars and other citizens around the ideas of democracy, justice, and human dignity. And I got a glimpse of the profound thinking that at that time, at that point in time, went into honoring that commitment as South African justices interpreted their constitution. It was clear in the justices' writings and in what they said at the conference that they saw themselves as part of a process of coming to terms with a history of atrocity, coming to terms with apartheid's denial of the dignity and humanity of Black and brown people. Seeing this, I could not help but think of studies I had done some years earlier, studies of how and why the United States had not taken on the work of coming to terms with the atrocity of slavery. The same thoughts came to me 4 years ago as I read Johar, the opinion of the highest court of India invalidating laws that criminalized same-sex intimacy, and noticed that the court positioned itself as post-colonial, and that the court professed a conscious effort to follow lessons of empathy and respect that were learned in the supremacist context of British colonization. This is not to idolize or idealize the South African or the Indian state. There are people here who know far more about both than I. It is to say that I saw simply at moments in their jurisprudence a reckoning with group-based cruelties. And I think that reckoning process nurtures the capacity for empathy and therefore facilitates recognition and respect for human rights. On the other hand, I see in the United States jurisprudence a denial of group-based cruelties, and as a consequence, a hobbled capacity for recognizing and respecting human rights. To put it differently, I believe that we in the United States would have a more just and humane set of constitutional principles were we to own and better understand our own history of throwing off supremacist oppression and how that process of throwing off supremacist oppression is associated with post-colonialism. Like South Africa and India, the United States is, I believe, post-colonial, but it is post-colonial in an atypical way. It is post-colonial in the sense, of course, that our country was formed in rebellion against British imperial rule. We seem, however, to be in denial about our post-colonial status, and the United States is not usually classified by others as a post-colonial nation. This has to do, I suppose, with the fact that the United States Revolution was more a rebellion of colonizers than a rebellion of indigenous people, more like a Boer War than like an indigenous or enslaved people's liberation struggle. I suppose it also has to do with the fact that many in the United States have thought of themselves as members of an already white country. Alas, many still do. And colonization is typically thought of in terms of white colonizers and Black, brown, and yellow colonized people. But I argue that the United States is post-colonial and in a double sense. The Revolution of 1775 was a war against distant monarchical rule and a war against governance without representation. But British rule over the 13 colonies was not as overtly supremacist as was European rule over lands that were populated more heavily or lastingly by indigenous people and other people of color. Disregard of native sovereignty and compromise with the institution of slavery factored heavily in the United States revolutionary calculus. And the result was an incomplete and imperfect founding constitution. The words of our Declaration of Independence, that all are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, was not explicitly given the force of law. That was impossible, for human chattel slavery was to be preserved, and it was wildly inconsistent with those words. The Constitution that followed did not disavow, but only papered over the new nation's developing caste structure. The Constitution contained no equal protection clause. The Bill of Rights was an afterthought that protected only against abuse from the national government. It contained no explicit right to vote. According to our Supreme Court, it still does not. No explicit right to be educated, to have any measure of social justice. States remained free to enslave or to disenfranchise. Citizenship was undefined, and the Supreme Court was able to announce in the Dred Scott case that African Americans could not qualify. The consequences of this are stunning, and it is stunning to see the extent to which they linger. A clear example is the United States' professed impotence in the enforcement of human rights. As you probably know better than I, and as Gay McDougall and others have eloquently pointed out, when the United States has signed core international human rights instruments, it has failed to make them self-executing. It has appended a statement saying that the United States understands that this covenant will be executed by the federal government only to the extent that it exercises legislative and judicial jurisdiction over the human rights matters that are covered, and otherwise by state and local governments. It has added that to the extent that state and local governments exercise jurisdiction over such matters, the federal government shall take measures appropriate to the federal system. Interesting to say that here in a very different federal system. This implies, of course, that there's a huge hole in the foundation of our government. It implies that the United States, unlike other constitutional democracies, has no enforceable national charter of human rights. But we needn't think that way. We need not think that way because the United States is post-colonial in a sense that I've yet to talk about. Putting aside the so-called American Revolution, I like to think of the United States Civil War as a war of liberation from colonial-style oppression, and to think of the post-Civil War Reconstruction as the formation of a new multiracial nation that would stand half-heartedly, at least, against supremacist oppression. To think this way is to adopt perspectives made visible by the great historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois and the preeminent contemporary historian of the United States Reconstruction, Eric Foner, for they've made it possible for us to think of enslaved people deserting plantations, to think of enslaved people claiming and working the lands on which they had labored without reward, to think of abolitionists who had not been enslaved also joining Union armies, to think of the people of the United States as a people engaged, at least since the beginning of the Civil War, in a struggle against supremacy and the cruelties it engenders, to think of the Reconstruction Amendments and of the post-Civil War civil rights statutes as having reformed the United States Constitution to be consistent with ideas embodied in the Declaration of Independence and in the original Constitution's preamble, an idea of human equality, an idea of liberty that encompassed not just the pursuit of personal happiness, but a communitarian pursuit of collective as well as individual happiness. This is a national story that engenders empathy and empowers federal enforcement of human rights. This is the story that Abraham Lincoln told and the first Justice Harlan echoed when they said that the Reconstruction Amendments had enacted a charter of liberty. But it is a story that is consistently squelched by what my colleagues and I have come to call a Confederate narrative. And the Confederate narrative is a story of states' rights. It's a story grounded in the assumption that people's rights are best protected by limiting federal power and protecting the power and independence of states. The Confederate narrative is most significant and notoriously significant for having protected slave power, undermined the Civil War amendments, and justified Jim Crow subordination. Under the banner of state sovereignty, state governments in the former Confederacy were complicit in the surveillance, harassment, and murder of any who dared to challenge segregation and white supremacy and iron-fisted control of labor. The Confederate narrative and its underlying assumptions about the importance of states' rights persist to this day, not only to justify racial subordination, but also to thwart opposition to the subordination of women and sexual minorities. The Confederate narrative's underlying assumptions about the importance of states' rights are at the heart of the Supreme Court's recent decision to overturn Roe against Wade, thus ending federal recognition of a right of abortion choice. Those same underlying assumptions could support reversal of Lawrence against Texas, thus ending federal recognition in the United States of the right of choice in intimate expression. And those same underlying assumptions could support reversal of the Obergefell decision, thus ending federal recognition in the United States of marriage choice. I began with a promise to show how national stories and national images affect a nation's understanding of constitutional democracy. I have dwelt a bit on the Confederate story of states' autonomy. I end with the story of an image. It is a story that was magnificently told by the art historian Peter Wood in his book-length study of a Winslow Homer painting. Both the book and the painting are called Near Andersonville. Somewhere there is a, yes, there it is. Here is the painting. This painting was largely unknown. Indeed, for many years, it was stored away in an attic and ignored by the family that had inherited it. For subsequent years, it could not find a buyer, and ultimately it was given to a somewhat obscure museum in a somewhat obscure city in New Jersey, which I won't name. What is thought to have been its original title, Near Andersonville, was unknown for a century. Over the years, it had been called A Colored Woman in Doorway. It had been called At the Cabin Door. And it had been called Captured Liberators. Captured Liberators was a reference to the relatively faint image in the upper left corner. And there is an enlargement of it. Bang. There you see Confederate soldiers marching captured Union soldiers to Andersonville, an appallingly wretched Confederate prisoner of war camp at which dozens of men died daily, and those who survived often looked like breathing skeletons. Peter Wood unearthed a beautiful history of the painting. It seems that it was given to a woman who had volunteered to teach in a Georgia Sea Island community. Union soldiers had driven slaveholding plantation masters from the community, and enslaved people had taken and begun to farm the abandoned land. These freed people built and founded schools in which Black and white teachers, many from the North, began to quench a deep thirst for education as a path to free citizenship. So this was not just a colored girl at a cabin door. Homer had centered, and Wood has recentered, a woman standing tall in the profoundly dangerous but surely momentous gateway to free citizenship. My hope is that the United States will construct a democracy that honors what I think Peter Wood has seen and what I now see in her clear, albeit fragile, expression of courage. I want to take you back to the full picture, and I hope that this will do it. And with that, I thank you again. Clumsy me. Thank you. Okay. The clicker.
Thank you, Professor Davis. May I invite you and our other panelists to please take a seat now and I'll get it.
Where would you like?
Wherever you like.
Okay.
Move this out of the way. Thank you again, and thank you all for being here. We'd like to begin our discussion this evening by giving our two other panelists, Dr. Vaishnav and Mr. Shade, the floor if you would like to react in a few words to the keynote address. That would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Do I need to use this?
I think it should be on.
Should be on. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yep. First of all, thank you to the Graduate Institute for this very kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be up here with you, and thank you for those remarks to kick off Democracy Week. I have very little to add because my scholarship of U.S. constitutionalism is rather limited, but just a couple of reflections on what you said. You know, as an American, there's sort of two things that I find unique about us as a species. Number one, we have complete historical amnesia about our own history. And the second is we sometimes forget that other countries have their own histories and their own domestic politics. And I think your talk and this event tries to remedy both of those shortcomings. The second point is, you know, at several points in your remarks, Peggy, I was thinking about this term that Robert Dahl, the political scientist, the great political scientist, developed called polyarchy. And it's something that's, I think, studied in undergraduate syllabi, but probably nowhere else. And the idea is that, you know, democracies consist of two axes. One is contestation and the other is participation. And if they do very well on both, they're in sort of, you can imagine a kind of, you know, X and Y and then the top right-hand corner. But Dahl doesn't call those advanced polities democracies. He calls them polyarchies because his argument is that you can never fully obtain the values and principles of full democracy. Democracy is always a work in progress, right? And so polyarchy is the closest human manifestation we have of democracy, but there can be regressions, there can be advances, and I think many times in your remarks, Peggy, I was reminded of that. Just very quickly, two more things. One is, you know, you touched upon Brazil and India, and I won't say anything about Brazil, but I think what's interesting about the Indian case is you have not only the world's longest constitution in terms of length, but also one of the most impressive ones, I think, in terms of its forward-thinking thoughtfulness and commitment to equality irrespective of religion or caste or gender identity. But yet there always exists, even in the best written constitutions, a gap between de jure constitutions and de facto realities. And I think that whether it's on questions of free speech, whether it's on the questions of political expression and the regulation of political parties, whether it's on the question of rape and partner choice, I think many democracies, including India's, have a long way to go to live up to the ideals which are very nicely expressed on paper. And the last point that I'll make is, at several times you talked about the sort of freedom of breaking through the sort of colonial narrative and the colonial framework. And what's interesting about that is that, in some societies, breaking through or breaking out of the colonial framework doesn't always mean a move towards liberalism and greater independence. I'm reminded of the fact that in today's India, there's a lot of talk about breaking the shackles of 1,200 years of slavery, right? So you've had the Mughals, and you've had the Turks and the Afghans, and you've had the British. And many people would put India's constitution as part of that residue of the colonial era. And so, it's interesting how these reactions to the colonial moment can be framed in multiple ways. But
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this. I'm sure you planned that this would happen the day after the elections in Brazil. So I'm very glad that it's going to be an easier task for me to talk and to compare notes with you. I'm not a scholar. I'm a journalist, and I bring bad news. Unfortunately, I do bring bad news, at least from Brazil. We just got final results a couple of hours ago from the first round, and it shows that the ultra-right movement received 50 million votes. They have elected a record number of representatives in Congress, and they may win a second term for president. I bring you another bad news, which is the fact that disinformation works. And it works, listening to your speech, obviously, it works in constructing also images and constructing narratives of things that absolutely are questionable. And something happened yesterday, and allow me to explain this. Something happened with me yesterday that I realized the power of narratives and disinformation. The election was going on. Brazilians can vote abroad. So the Brazilian consulate in Geneva was very full. And 2 hours before the voting had finished, the Bolsonarist groups started to receive by WhatsApp the results of the polls in Geneva. They were in line still to vote, right? And the results that they received were numbers, very accurate. Not only Bolsonaro won, it was with numbers. You think, who's going to believe that? They're still waiting to vote. Well, the second part of the message said, if these results are not confirmed, it is because there was a manipulation. And you think, who's going to believe that? So the votes finished. A couple of hours later, the results of the polls in Geneva were posted in front of the session of the consulate, basically the place where the consulate had rented to do the elections, and they showed a victory of Lula. And what was the reaction of the supporters of Bolsonaro? It was not, oh my, we lost. The reaction was, we knew it, that it was going to be manipulated. And they went absolutely crazy with that information. Obviously, it's a tiny insignificant part of the elections in Brazil. But it made me think, if this construction of narrative happened in a very tiny little place, like the Brazilian consulate in Geneva, what is happening behind this process? And it made me very scared, because they all left convinced that they had won the election. When you talk about things that linger from the past, in the case of Brazil, and I'm sure it's the case of the US as well, they also define our future. They don't stay in the past, or they reach us and will not define us. Differently from the US, in Brazil, we have a constitution that is from 1988, which is called even a democratic constitution. But my generation thought, wrongly, that it was in our birth certificate, that it said, name, Jamil Shad, gender, whatever, condition, democracy. It does not come in your birth certificate. And perhaps our biggest mistake was to think that these narratives did not have space. After all, we have a constitution. After all, we have rules. But I'm also convinced, and using what you said, that we are not a post-colonial nation. And the facts prove this basically every day. For the last 100 years, we had a theory of racial democracy in Brazil that was very useful to some to justify that, yes, this is a country where everyone has the same rights, except that they don't, and except that these rights are not translated into rights. So what you mentioned, the picture you showed is basically one that could well illustrate a part of history of Brazil, without any doubt. And in fact, I do think that if we don't deal with that, if in the case of Brazil, there's no recognition that this is a challenge for democracy, there's no chance that a democratic system can achieve its results. I like very much the fact that you put on the title of the week, the construction of democracy, because now with Bolsonaro, many claim that we have to rebuild democracy. My question is, for millions of Brazilians, and probably millions of Indians, and probably millions of Americans, it has never reached them, in fact. So how can you rebuild something that for so many simply was a myth? And perhaps it's arrogance from part of us to think that, we're losing something that we had, while so many did not even dream of having it yet. And at the same time, huge resistance from those who are not ready and will not give up privileges without a fight. So the crossroad is huge, probably in the US, but from my part, in Brazil, this was not an election, and it's not an election that will choose a president. It is an election that will show who we are. And in many cases, what the image we are seeing is really horrible. So I end my comments there.
Sorry.
Jamil, perhaps I can follow up with a question. I, perhaps like you, was glued to the television last night, and I happened to be tuned to the BBC, where Carlos Pereira, who is a political scientist at FGV, was being interviewed. And Carlos said something that struck me because he said that this election actually underscored the consolidation of democracy in Brazil.
Yes.
I'd like to get your reaction to that comment, but I'd also like to ask you and sort of press you on this point, which is now that we move to a runoff, should it be established that Bolsonaro does lose, right, the election, and should he attempt to stay in power, what is the likelihood that he will call upon armed sympathizers, echoing Trump's own actions, or even upon the military?
Yes. First, I do understand this idea of an election that is helping to consolidate democracy, because you had never had such a social movement, such a mobilization of minority groups, of so many actors in society aware of the threat of a second term of Bolsonaro. So in that sense, yes, in that sense, in a horrible sense, Bolsonaro was very useful to mobilize social forces to understand that they cannot sit in their couch and wait for democracy to happen. So in that way, huge chunks of society in Brazil stood up, and that is very positive. That is perhaps the positive story of these last couple of months. Now, it remains to be seen if this is enough. It remains to be seen if this mobilization will be enough, one, to create awareness that specific model of government is one that will shrink civic space. And the second element, which is your second question, is whether he will accept the result. Because if he does not accept the result, it's not an election that will, it's an election that will be testing if our democratic system is solid enough. You asked what can happen. At this moment, this is the worst possible scenario, which is the fact that he is not far in terms of percentage points from the leading candidate. Let's say, a bright solution would be a clear-cut victory by Lula in the first round, not because of the election of Lula, but as a huge no to that other model. That would have been an ideal situation if you want to dismantle that model. The electoral, society did not choose that path. Okay. Now, two elements that we have to consider. First, since day one in his government, he has flexibilized gun laws in a way that Brazil had never seen. So in 4 years, he managed to arm 1 million people, civilians. So this is obviously something that puts a huge question mark on the day after of I do not accept the result. This is the first element. Second element is absolutely the military. In the case of Brazil, they're used to power. Every 30 years, they come back. No? So it's, and the 30-year period is ending, so, you know, maybe the expiry date of the yogurt is about to run. But there's a difference at this point of time. First, with Bolsonaro's government, what happened was that he managed to insert in government 3,000 military personnel, generals, commanders, etc. So they are the government already. The Minister of Health, Brazil, with so many doctors, expertise in tropical diseases and everything else, chose as Minister of Health the general, who had no idea absolutely about anything, but that's another question. They all took responsibilities in this current government. The question is, will they accept to give up to these posts and go back That is the big question mark. And no one knows, no one can be sure today what percentage of these generals are ready to be on board. Perhaps the biggest difference with the US is not the bright mind of the president, is most likely the fact that in the US, the army did not follow Trump's lead. In Brazil, there's a question mark on that.
Perhaps I could just push you a little bit more on the topic of mobilization, because studies have suggested that Bolsonaro voters scored high in terms of in-group loyalty, authority, and religiosity. And my question concerns the extent to which this has either remained the same during the current election, or whether you see the base as having shifted somewhat.
No, it was very solid. We could see neo-Pentecostal evangelical movements still very strongly with him. We could see the police forces and, let's say, the police apparatus in the country, which is huge if you include the army, civil police, etc., still very much with him. You can still see a very important segment of the financial sector also with him. So I'm not sure that the hardcore groups have shifted. What I do think is that these social movements that were hugely affected by his policies managed to at least bring to attention some of the threats that they encountered in the last 4 years. This made possible a shift in some of, I would say, the middle class votes, some of the higher class votes that could be seduced by the fact that so many groups have been basically killed or simply have taken their rights out. If it is enough, I'm not sure. Again, the votes yesterday, 56 million votes to Lula, 50 million to Bolsonaro, more or less. It is very hard to think that all these 56 million votes went to Lula. So a part of them, yes, but a part of them still was the no and the, let's say, the option of listening to these social movements.
Thank you. Perhaps we could turn to Milan now and to India. Your work, Milan, documents how parties harness both state power and unofficial street power to pursue their core objectives. The BJP's failure, in particular, to condemn extrajudicial violence aimed primarily at Muslims, its celebration or glorification of perpetrators, condoning, if not officially sanctioning, such violence. In light of these developments, would you comment on the extent to which political violence has become social, and by a similar token, the extent to which we are witnessing the politicization of social violence in India?
I mean, I think I would step back for a second, and this panel is on citizenship, right? And I think what we are seeing is a renegotiation of the idea of citizenship, right? I mean, if you rewind the clock, maybe now's an opportune moment. On August 15th, India celebrated, 75 years of independence. It's quite remarkable to look back and think about how, through its constitutional and legal architecture, it really endeavored to create the foundations for liberal democracy, right? One that afforded its citizens equal rights and equal protection under the law. And unlike many other post-colonial societies, the leadership at the time rejected this simple equation of religion, ethnicity, and belonging, right? And decided that the only way you could keep democracy together in such a fractious society was really leaning into that diversity, right? and finding some unity in it, right? So it's sort of mutual accommodation of differences. And where we are today is that I think that consensus that has been intact for a number of decades is unraveling. You talked about narratives, right? There was another narrative that was present at the creation of the Constitution, one that was much more narrowly pitched around a nation that was defined as a Hindu one that basically said that Hindu culture and Indian culture are synonymous. They're coterminous with one another. And after all, 80% or so of the population is Hindu, so they deserve sort of first among equals status, right? And so I think the alternative narrative, which is sort of ascendant today, states that, you know, loyalty to the Hindu nation is sort of paramount in this conception of nationalism, right? And we can talk about what has given rise to this. I would argue that some of it has to do with the secular order's own internal failings, but we can come back to that. But the challenges to citizenship are occurring on two dimensions. One is a formal legal argument, thinking about how to change existing citizenship laws in ways that might disenfranchise or disadvantage religious minorities, namely Muslims. But the second, and I think this is where your question is really aimed, is there's a second notion of citizenship, right, which is not sort of de jure citizenship, but really this sort of social citizenship, this idea that you know, there is an overall sense of belonging to this kind of imagined community of the nation, right? And that has to do with the exercise of de facto rights and privileges. And I think what we are seeing today is a growing intolerance, sense of exclusion, sense of discrimination that's aimed towards India's religious minorities, namely Muslims, of which there are, you know, 240 million, give or take. And I think while many of these challenges or attitudes have deep roots, I think they've undeniably been accelerated by changes in the political system. And I think there are three that worry me, right? The first is what you said, which is the clear uptick in anti-Muslim violence, right? Where there is both state sanction as well as unofficial sanction given to civil society groups who have basically taken law and justice into their own hands, right? But there are other attributes beyond violence I think we should worry about, right? One would be declining political representation, for instance, right? I mean, this is a government which has no representation of Muslims, right? Which is something that is unprecedented in Indian history. And so, although Muslims have long been underrepresented, we've now seen new lows. At every level, you could look at, you know, local, state, national. You could look at the bureaucracy. You could look at the police. You could look at other institutions of the state. But I think the third, and this is the hardest to quantify, is that there's a general sense of anxiety amongst minorities and a sense of disillusionment about their status in society. And I would say in some quarters, even a resignation that there is underway the construction of a new order in which there is a sort of tiered citizenship, where you have the normal citizenship in which you have all the rights and privileges enjoyed by the Constitution, and then you have a second class, where, yes, legally you're allowed to remain resident in India, but not necessarily avail either in formal legal sense or an informal social sense of the fruits of citizenship. And I think that's a very, very dangerous sort of direction that we're looking into at the moment.
Absolutely. Perhaps I could push you just a little bit more on some of these points, right? So if religion has become the overriding condition for citizenship in India, right? And if, as you've suggested in various pieces of yours, that other social cleavages such as caste, region, and language do not pose as great a threat to democracy relative to religion, in part due to their cross-cutting nature, right? Perhaps you could speak a little bit as to subnational variation in the electoral success that the BJP has enjoyed or failed to enjoy in India, right? So I'm thinking in particular about its performance in southern India, right? Can its inability to make inroads here be attributed to social cleavages or to some other set of factors, right? Perhaps you could shed some light on what is happening in this particular instance.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, federalism is in many senses an important sort of safety valve, right? It's a contrast a little bit, Peggy, I think, to some of the points that you made about the states' rights argument sometimes being a force for bad as opposed to a force for good. But I would make a couple of points here, Ravi. I mean, I think one is that it's undeniable that Mr. Modi took a party which had been relegated to certain parts of West and North and Central India and made it a pan-Indian party, right? I mean, if you look at any electoral map, you will now find representation of the BJP in the North, the East, the South, and the West, although it's true that there's an entire section of, I would call it the Eastern Seaboard, running all the way from Bengal to Orissa to Andhra Pradesh down to Tamil Nadu, where they are relatively weak. And these are precisely the places where you have had a much stronger sense of subnational identity. And frankly, I think a respect and embrace of the idea that, you know, India is a mosaic. It is a composite culture. It is not a monolith. And many of these fights that the Tamils and the Telugus and the Bengalis fought in the last century were about maintaining respect for linguistic autonomy, maintaining ways for cultural autonomy, right? And I think in some sense, that sort of top-down imposed vision that often coincides with the kind of Hindu nationalist rhetoric they're somewhat allergic to that. But I think that I think two things are true. One is that we are seeing the collapse of any pan-Indian opposition to the BJP, right? I mean, you had the Congress Party, which has now become a shell of its former self, right? And so in parts of the country where the BJP has not been ascendant, where the Congress is evaporating before our eyes, I do think that creates a new opening. It also creates an opportunity, though, for other, we used to call, you know, third forces in Indian politics to come to the fore. But I think it's a long-term exercise, right? We're only now seeing the beginnings of that creative destruction in national politics. And they're starting at a huge disadvantage because most of the opposition in India is, you know, single state opposition or even sometimes single sub-region within a state, right? And so stitching together a narrative behind a leader and a common minimum program that all of these subnational groups could coalesce around, I think is a monumental task, right? And so I think many people who look at the next general election in 2024 are not very pessimistic that those forces would be able to gather in such a time. And frankly, they've been very slow. I mean, if you look at the extent of creative destruction in politics over the past 8 years, there has been surprisingly little of it in opposition to the BJP. Most of the innovation, the mobilization, the organization, the gathering of funds and so on has been done by the incumbent party as opposed to the opposition.
Thank you. Peggy, perhaps we could return back now full circle to the United States. And of course, I do have some questions to tie this all together in more of a comparative perspective. But as you've documented in your talk, the US is in the midst of a constitutional crisis over the notion of substantive due process, right, with the proclivity for further limiting or ever more narrowly defining constitutional liberty, right? And amidst what I would sort of view as a secular rise in racism, in both social and institutional, or sort of, otherwise referred to as systemic racism, which manifests in education, in health, in wealth, in justice, in segregation, amongst a host of other outcomes. What do you see as the way forward? Right? To what extent is confrontation, right, the unwanted, or perhaps an unwanted, but inevitable outcome?
Well, the word confrontation is a frightening one in the present American context. My sense is that the country is in a very volatile state, that confrontation is, at this time, more likely to come from the right than from either progressive forces or minority forces. And many of us tremble to think what will happen if the next couple of rounds of elections go badly. It's easy to imagine a kind of confrontation that we're not used to predicting, because we're used to predicting uprisings by the oppressed. And what we're seeing are uprisings by a group of, to some extent, oppressed, but certainly to a great extent privileged people, panicked about being replaced, and willing to be violent in order to prevent that. And we have leaders who, it seems, will stop at nothing and have no sense of hesitation about stirring up that passion. So, what can I tell you?
Let me pose one final question to all three of you, because I'm sure the audience is eager to ask you questions as well. 2018 brought Bolsonaro into power in Brazil. 2016 saw Donald Trump in the United States, and of course 2014 ushered in the Modi regime in India, right? Each of you have commented more specifically on one of these cases. Yet if we take a more macro perspective, given that Brazil, India, and the United States constitute 3 of the 4 largest democracies in the world, right? How might we place what is happening into comparative perspective, right? Where in particular do you see developments in these 3 cases converging, and where perhaps do you see them diverging?
Well, I certainly see them diverging in terms of constitutional jurisprudence. The courts of the High Court in the United States is moving wildly and radically to the right. And I have some hope that in India, there is more stability and more of a commitment to democratic principles. I don't know about Brazil. But tell me, what do you think about India?
I think on your point, Peggy, about the sort of rule of law and constitutional jurisprudence, I think, one of the most notable developments in the past several years since I think, we have to remind ourselves that what we are seeing today is the first single-party majority government that the country had in 3 decades, right? Not since Indira Gandhi in the early 1980s has this kind of majority been put together. And I think that shift in the political balance of power has a direct material impact on the ways in which checks and balances and what I call referee institutions, how they function. And I think what we've seen in a number of cases with the courts is actually excessive deference paid to the executive. Some people have gone as far as to call it evasion, because they are either unwilling or unable to take decisions that confront the priorities of the political executive. And so the easiest way out is to not hear those cases at all. And so we have seen, for instance, the constitutional challenge to the redefinition of Jammu and Kashmir, which took place in 2019, yet to be heard by the court. There was a new, pretty radical change in campaign funding, which now legitimizes completely opaque giving to from individuals or firms to political parties without either the recipient or the donor having to disclose the transaction. The courts have not yet heard that case, even though it's been pending now for upwards of 3 years. And so I think the more interesting question to ask is why? Why is this happening, right? And I think there are a number of plausible hypotheses. One is just this fear of going against where popular opinion is, right? And what that does to you as a leader of an institution. I think the second is their career incentives. For judges in the Indian case, there's a mandatory retirement age of 65, but judges are often chosen to serve in quite plum post-retirement jobs on commissions and tribunals and as heads of agencies. And so you might think to behave differently in your final months and years in office for fear of losing out on what that opportunity might be. And I think a third possibility is one where you actually fear state retribution, where in many of these countries that we've been discussing, the executive has quite a lot of discretionary authority when it comes to launching investigations into someone's background, into their tax history, into their personal history. And so that can be used as a way to sort of keep people on side, right? So I think there's a very delicate dance going on, but I think it all stems from the fact that we had 3 decades of coalition rule in which actually the politicians themselves found it advantageous to have these institutions assert themselves because you couldn't go to sleep at night certain that you would be brought back to power the next day. But now we're in a situation where actually there's a pretty good amount of certainty that at least for the foreseeable future, that will be the case.
Well, I have to say that a court that's hesitant to act, that's punting, and that may be imagining currying favor seems to me a better option than what we have in the United States, which is a court that is running headlong in the direction of the Trumpites.
I mean, I would just say one final thing, and the systems are always very different in the process of judicial appointment. One of the downsides of having a mandatory retirement age is that you can have chief justices who are only in office for 3 months because they hit that age. But there's a lot of churn, and there are quite a number of powers vested in the hands of the chief justice. And so that also gives an opportunity for change. And I would just note in the past couple of weeks, some of these long pending cases, not the ones I mentioned, but other ones, have now been scheduled for a review. So I think there is some room for maybe some cautious optimism, because the Chief Justice is known as the master of the roster who decides what cases are heard and which sub-benches hear those cases. So that's also an important design difference, I think, that the United States, of course, had precisely the opposite.
Well, in the case of Brazil, I think we're in the middle of this debate, but basically the Supreme Court has acted as, interestingly, I would say the last resort of protection of the democratic system in Brazil. And that is why the election yesterday was so important. And the fact that Bolsonaro won so many seats in the Senate, meaning that he will be able to choose justice ministers in the probably in the next 3-4 years. So if that changes, obviously the entire composition of balance of power will also change. The Supreme Court was absolutely instrumental in maintaining some kind of rule of law in the country. And without the Supreme Court today, we would not be perhaps even having an election at this point of time. So it is a difficult situation for the Supreme Court. I know some of the ministers that are being obliged to walk around with heavily armed bodyguards, and it's not against, they're not being protected against terrorists or foreign agents or whatever. They're being targeted by supporters of the executive branch. So it is, if you tell this story, they say, oh, these journalists. It cannot be that a country does face this situation, but it's true, and this is the reality today. Now, if he wins, then the entire balance of power changes, and obviously with the Senate in this position, perhaps we'll have a situation like yours.
Condolences.
So I would now like to invite members of the audience, both who are here in person as well as our audience who is participating virtually, to please pose questions either to the entire panel or to individual speakers.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. I'm feeling a little bit, I feel despair after this panel. And I'm quite an optimistic person, or a cautious optimistic person. And I look at the case of the US. We feared that President Trump would be re-elected, and actually he was not. So maybe there is a glimpse of hope for the future of our democracies, because if we look at the 3 largest democracies and we see some pattern and this impact of disinformation, and we should also talk about online platforms and digital technologies and the role of these companies as well that play in this context. But I'm wondering if we could find maybe some hopes for the future, and also for future generation. We're a university, we're here with the youth, and we need also it's our role as well to give them a way forward. So what would that be? Thank you.
Oh my, he's asking for hope. Well, there has to be, right? There has to be a way forward. We can't just collapse. And so I can only speak to the United States case. But there's kind of a desperate struggle around these midterm elections. And it's crucially important. And at this moment, it doesn't seem to me that the outcome will necessarily be terrible, which is not the most hopeful thing you've ever heard, I'm sure. But it's somewhat hopeful. And to get past that and to, I don't know, I mean, I would see, this is bold, but I would see hope in expanding the court. And I suppose it's become clear that I have a tendency to want to cling to the judicial branch as a savior. But I think we have eked out a little bit of hope for the judicial branch, at least in India. And I don't know what to say about this. But there's that. And of course, there's the electorate. You know, and when I say that, I can only pine that we don't have the kind of participatory elan that I see in this country. But would that we could stimulate that.
I mean, I would just start by saying that, you know, every decade since the 1950s, there has been somebody who has written the big book on why Indian democracy is bound to fail, and all of those books have later been proven wrong. So we have 7 decades of gloom and doom that were upended. I think the second is that, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that when we talk about a key part of the democratic process, namely elections, that India still to this day has a remarkably admirable record when it comes to the integrity and procedural delivery of elections, that I think for somebody who's in the United States, where we struggle very much with the procedural delivery, I think that's no small success. Now, one shouldn't make the mistake of defining a democracy downwards to only being inclusive of electoral procedures, but obviously it is an important foundation. And the third thing I would say is that, anyone who is from there, has spent time there in India, will right away recognize that it's a place where there's tremendous amounts of social churn, you know. I mean, 2 statistics that I always come back to, in the 2019 general election, there were 120 million first-time voters, people between the ages of 18 and 23 who had never voted in a general election. And that's about the entirety of the American electorate who voted in 2016, right? So and the second is that we are seeing unexpected and quite welcome expressions of that social churning. You know, one that I would point to off the top of my head is the role of women in politics. You know, for decades, there has been a sizable gender disadvantage in who comes out to vote. Women were about 8 to 10 percentage points less likely to turn out to vote than male members of their household. And for the first time on record in 2019, women actually enjoyed a higher voter participation rate than men, and it's never happened before, right? And so I think that also has important implications for how politics is played, and hopefully can create to a further kind of opening up of the political space.
And I think there's a chance that Dobbs will have a similar effect in the United States. Although women have voted in decent numbers, I think the numbers will be even greater going forward, at least in the immediate future.
Can I just add a very quick suggestion? Insist with the youth on what to read and how to read, because we are having a huge issue of losing, not the press losing credibility, but academia, scientists, everyone that had basically spent their lives in a thesis or whatever, being questioned by a tweet. And it's absurd if you think, but it's the reality. So the other day, very quick story. You know, for the last 2 years, we have spent as journalists here in Geneva covering WHO, pandemic, Tedros, pandemic, you know, the press conferences every day. And I don't know why, I'm in a WhatsApp group of ultra millionaires from Brazil, in Brazil. Maybe they think that I have a bank account in Switzerland. And so they think, oh, let's put them in the same. They're all over 50, 60 years old. They're all in São Paulo, Rio. And in the middle of the pandemic, a text came with one of them saying, the pandemic is over. Chloroquine will save us. And with lots of stars and celebrating. That day, by chance, CDC in the US had put out a letter saying to the academia, don't invest any longer in researching chloroquine. It's not, don't give chloroquine. Don't even research any further, because it has been proven it doesn't work. I took that letter and I put it in the group. I had never spoken in the group. I had never, it wasn't on my group. I put that letter, and the reaction was, who said this is a real letter? No one questioned the initial statement. Right. And everyone questioned CDC. And I said, yeah, true. You know, these communist journalists, they may do stupid things. So I went to the link of CDC and I put the link. And the next reaction was, watch out, it can be hacked by the Chinese. I said, we lost the war. That's the truth. You know, when CDC is questioned by a tweet or link, or the election yesterday has a situation like this, it's because we have a huge issue on the credibility of either information or analysis or all of that. This, for me, will be a key point. I'm not pessimistic. I do think, for example, in the case of Brazil, that the rise of so many social groups of vulnerable communities and stepping up to the challenge was incredible. So I do think this was a very positive element. Now, if the element of flux of information is not dealt, we'll continue with this talk here forever.
Questions? Sir.
With apologies both to Milan and Jamil, because there are all sorts of questions I could ask about India and Brazil. Sorry, Peggy, I'm going to have to come back to you. I'm an American, as you can hear. And I just wondered, what about Kansas? That vote in Kansas, what's the significance of that? And does it mean that no, people do react when things go too far in one direction?
Yes, yes.
Do you know what I'm talking about, the vote in Kansas?
I do, and I mentioned a few moments ago, I think that women's reaction to Dobbs could be very significant and could affect the upcoming election in a dramatic way. We don't know yet. And I think we don't know the extent to which that emotion and fury will be sustained because we don't know the extent to which the related rights that are put under threat are valued as dearly. But I certainly agree that Kansas was a ray of hope, and the feminine reaction, the women's reaction to Dobbs is a ray of hope, and how to broaden that commitment is a question I can't answer, but I'm going to work on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. The name is Abraham. I'm Indian. When I think of diversity and constitutional rights in any of these countries, three, or in any other countries, we must remember and should remember that we are all shaped by our education to think whether the diversity is right or whether the constitutional right is going well. And in my opinion, we are always bound to have differences. And diversity in itself is enough to destroy the world, let alone constitutional rights. You can have thousands of arguments of people, particularly in democracies, who say that our constitution is nice, it's well balanced, and it has a meaning. But I'm not so sure, that any constitutional right shapes humanity to become better. My aim always has been that humanity should become better. But to become better, you need to appreciate the diversity, and you need to appreciate the constitutional rights of each of the countries that we go to or we live in. And I'm afraid that we are very, very far away from that. And I would hate to want to think or believe that we'll end up discussing such important issues in what is a conference room related setup. I think we need to break out of this and to see how we can reach the world. And reaching the world is not going to be an easy thing. Thank you.
How do we reach the world?
Well, what happened in the last 4 years in Brazil was basically the takeover of the educational system by part of the military in order to reshape with their own views. Obviously, very scary thought, meaning they know it matters. They know that is what will generate a new, or will build a new generation that eventually will think closer to their possibilities or to their ideas. So yes, I have no question. The biggest revolution probably in Brazil was the fact that the quota system came on board in terms of universities with the Afro-Brazilians coming on board for the last 10 years, and that has reshaped society in a way. It's starting to reshape society. I have friends that are professors at universities, and they say it has enriched our courses. I'm obliged to bring other authors and other narratives to the story, because obviously my public, my audience does not take a certain view only of things, and that has started to reshape the nation. Now, funny enough, there are those who are in opposition, because basically it will question the roots of the entire system, which is based in privileges, legacy of 300 years of slavery, etc., etc. So yes, that is, in my opinion, the biggest key in terms of changing. Now, the problem is the 33 million hungry people in Brazil need a solution for tomorrow. And they cannot wait for the next generation because they simply will not survive until the next generation. The other possibility is basically using the Constitution to make sure that those rights are assured. Yes, the transformation will have to happen, but somehow we have to make that, in the case of Brazil, that Constitution work, because it does assure that the state has the obligation to feed or to give health. So it will be a balance in somehow. You cannot wait for the next generation in order to solve someone's health issues today. But yes, you're right, education will be essential.
I think we perhaps have time for one final question.
Thank you very much for all the panelists and to Professor Cooper Davis. My point is about one of the suggestions that you made about predicting uprisings from the oppressed, which is what we were used to, and the paradoxical factor of now seeing the uprising of those who we tended to think just a few decades ago like middle classes. And it made me think of this book, The Age of Anger, precisely, of Pankaj Mishra, I don't know if I pronounce it well, where he explains that we live in an age of anger, and the anger is manipulated by authoritarian democrats, if this expression can be used or make sense at all, because they easily exploit the failures of neoliberalism and the fact of global factors that precisely affect all these countries that we are discussing here, because it's a general global trend that we are exploring. And to this extent, there are factors like distrust in traditional political parties who have become less representative and of this majoritarian, white people, the US, in the case of the US, that feel disenfranchised in a sense of not represented. And what these leaders do, in fact, and this is also very well explained in many recent books about this phenomenon, what they do is and it links to the misinformation type of and disinformation type of trend. They just propose easy solutions to problems which are global problems that are not easy and are structural problems of our economies and societies that are not easy to deal with. And therefore, we see all these ideas of building walls, in the south of Spain, in Melilla, or in the US with Mexico, and we see easy solutions like kicking out all migrants and all these things that affect. And of course, the problem, I think, it affects disproportionately minority rights and all the rights that we thought they were part of the Constitution. So I wonder whether this is an explanation that it's, or an account or a narrative, to use that is not just the constitutional narrative, but a much more global one that it's embedded into the way in which globalization has been built through significant exclusions of actually the majority of people. And now we are just blaming minorities arbitrarily, or blaming diversity for a major crisis that is systemic. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to have a coherent response. I think you raised a lot of sort of excellent points. I mean, I think, just to pick up on one of them, I mean, I do think that it's hard to have this discussion in a vacuum without considering global factors, right? And certainly the rise of globalization, the linkages with economic inequality, the inability of mainstream political parties to then mount an effective response to those twin challenges, I think has in part led us to the sense of democratic malaise that we experience all around the world, right? But I do think there's a second part of the external challenge which is worth pointing out, which is that I think given the current state of geopolitics in the world, there also is a calculation made by some would-be autocrats that frankly there's not much of a price to pay abroad. Because we might have our eyes on other balls. That might be Russia, it might be our eye on the China ball, maybe energy flows and concerns about inflation. And so I do think that, bringing this back to global Geneva, international Geneva, that these institutions here do have a role to play in the way in which they can be used to name and shame, or to call a spade, and to put an increased pressure, I think, on autocrats, because I do think that there is a sense of a sort of human rights holiday that that has gone around the world, where there actually has been little sort of price to pay for going beyond the bounds of the Constitution. Would you like to add anything, Peggy?
I can't.
Jamil?
No, I wish I could.
I just agree with what you said about the global Geneva, or the multilateral system being quite silent in many of these cases. And when it's not silent, it shows a very structural problem in dealing with them. So I do agree with you that, and I speak, for example, in the case of Brazil, specifically in the case of Brazil, it does not seem to be a problem for this government to basically say that he will not respect elections, because what could happen internationally? One of the talks I got from an internal source there saying, look at Erdogan. He's still a privileged interlocutor for the Europeans after all he did. So why are we going to be a problem? For example, we export food to the world. So who is going to put sanctions on food exported from Brazil in a moment of inflation and problems perhaps coming from the East? So I do see some kind of correlation between the lack of push from abroad and the somehow the possibility of speaking and talking about these things with no constraint, with no we're not thinking, well, we're going to have sanctions from abroad. Are we?
I mean, just a final point. I think it's important also that our perspective change, those of us in the West. You know, I mean, I think for a long time the conversation on human rights and democracy has been of a lecturing, kind of hectoring sort. And I'm encouraged, if you look at what's come out of this current administration in the United States, and at least as regards talking to India, where it's not about, you need to get your democratic house in order, but actually the United States and India could do well by talking about our joint struggles and challenges that we face with democracy, and recognize that they very much are joint based on, and I think there is I think beginning from that place of humility is not a bad place to start, and we've had too little of that, I think, in most Western capitals for quite a long time.
If we can consider that a positive note, I think we can end.
I think it is a positive note.
End the discussion there. I'd like to thank you all for being here with us, for engaging in the discussion, and of course, please join me in thanking our speakers for a wonderful session.
Thank you.